Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Gauging the Maturity of Your AP Department, the Linchpin to AP Process Improvement. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. For any technical questions, please use the chat box and I'll respond to you right away. If you have any issues with the audio today, click on the phone icon that's above the chat window to receive the teleconference details. For those of you who have called in, to ensure top quality, all your lines have been muted. If you're disconnected, you can log on again using the details provided in your initial confirmation email. If you continue to experience difficulties, please feel free to write to us at mr.kessler@zycus.com. We encourage you to ask questions throughout the entire presentation. Please type your questions in the chat box and hit the send button to submit them. This program will be recorded and you'll receive a thank you email along with the on-demand webinar materials within 2 business days. So today's speaker is Mr. Richard Waugh. As a Vice President for Corporate Development, Richard leads strategic initiatives in the area of new product introduction, market development, thought leadership, analyst relation, and strategic partner development programs. Richard has an extensive background in B2B e-commerce. He has helped launch GE's Trading Process Network, the first online marketplace for sourcing and procurement. He was also the co-founder of B2E Markets, one of the first SaaS sourcing suite providers, and later covered the supplier management market as an industry analyst for the Aberdeen Group. At this point, I'd like to hand things over to Richard to take over.
Thank you, Sanjivani, and thanks everyone for joining today as we help you gauge the maturity of your AP department. And just before I get into the agenda for this session, I wanted to give you a little bit of context. Zycus is actually an integrated suite of source-to-pay solutions. And in the AP automation and e-invoicing space, the Zycus software solution, which is all cloud-based or software as a service, encompasses both the supplier-facing components of the supplier network, so supplier information management capability for streamlining the supplier onboarding process to capture master data about suppliers, things like supplier profiles, W-9s, certificates of insurance, and those kinds of things, and also to measure and manage supplier risk. The other component that's supplier-facing is a self-service portal. So this would enable suppliers to initiate electronic invoices, to track on a self-service basis their own invoice approval and payment status, and actually collaborate with the AP organization around initiatives like early pay discounts or dynamic discounts for invoices. And then on the AP organization side, we'll call it Invoice Express, full AP automation, so automated invoice matching, you know, a 3-way match to the PO and goods receipt, for example, automated approval workflow routing to get those invoices approved and paid, and full reporting capability. And as I mentioned earlier, the ability then to collaborate with the supply base around dynamic discount optimization. So that's the software backdrop, but we're going to talk not just about software and technology today, but maturity overall within AP groups. And in terms of the agenda then, we want to start with the state of AP automation, sort of set the baseline here, and then I'm going to introduce an evolution curve model that provides a growth path, both for AP departments in terms of organizational growth, but also for AP professionals in their own career development and growth. We're also going to talk about what are some of the top challenges and goals across AP groups. We'll introduce then the maturity model to help you benchmark your current performance and where you may be along this evolutionary path. I'm going to share some brand new benchmark data that provides some metrics to help track progress towards the goal of becoming not just an average organization, but a top performer, best in class. And then finally, I'll share a case study. So we're talking a lot about evolution, which certainly implies a very long duration in time. But in this case study, for example, I think it's very heartening that we can look at how one company went from really the initial nascent stage on that maturity model to a best in class in less than 12 months. So we're not talking about these kinds of evolutions having to take an exorbitant amount of time. It can be accomplished pretty quickly, especially with some of the newer technologies available on the market, such as I just gave you a preview to. So that's the agenda. I want to start at the beginning then. What's the current state of AP automation? And this data then comes from a survey done by IOFM, the Institute of Finance and Management, and just asking AP organizations, would you consider yourselves today to be highly automated, sort of at a mid-level of automation, or a low level? And I think the results are pretty revealing in that just 23%, less than 1 in 4, would say that their AP today is highly automated. So almost a half or somewhere in the middle, at sort of a medium level of automation, while fully 29% admit low automation today. So lots of room for improvement, lots of upside if you look at sort of that baseline automation as a starting point. So this is where we want to talk about the fact that there's an sort of a natural evolution that we see taking place in the market as AP teams sort of ramp up along this curve. And, you know, on the left-hand side, we sort of look at 4 distinct stages, if you will, and going back to the previous pie chart that said 29% admitted to low levels of automation, you know, by and large, they're stuck at that first stage where, you know, essentially they're drowning in paper, or maybe they're getting PDF invoices sent as email attachments, but for the most part, really no automation, lots of paper, lots of manual data entry going on. And as we move along that curve, the 50% or thereabouts that said they had medium levels of automation are probably at either stage 2 or 3, in that they may not be purely paper anymore. They've probably introduced either some type of scanning or OCR, optical character recognition, to start converting the paper invoices that they're receiving into at least a digital image at that stage. Still not optimal yet, because, you know, the scanned image then has to be, or even the OCR'd image, if you will, has to be reviewed for accuracy, or additional data entry needs to be performed. So the final stage, really the optimal stage in this evolutionary curve, is where you start from the beginning with a digital invoice. So that means utilizing e-invoicing technology to kickstart that entire process with a truly digital electronic invoice that doesn't have to go through some type of a conversion process such as scanning or OCR. You're starting with an accurate electronically formatted document, so the process that ensues is already more efficient because you're starting with a truly digital image. So that's the evolutionary curve sort of from the organizational standpoint. On the right-hand side, though, the AP professional themselves is going to go through an evolution, and it really promises a much more rewarding career path as you move along this curve, because, you know, starting at the beginning, you're really looking at a back office transactional processor function, you know, really limited in terms of the scope of value that can be contributed because of the manual and tactical transactional nature of the work itself. At the next stage, through the introduction of some of the automation and technology tools, there's a transition happening from an AP clerk to more of a cost impactor. And typical of this stage is AP getting actually more integrated into the full procure-to-pay process to really be able to address more bottom-line savings opportunities to the business, either through more compliant purchases, so better stewardship of company funds, maximizing things like early pay discounts or P-card rebates and the like. And then sort of the last stage in this evolution is really realizing that transition for the AP professional to become, a trusted business partner, really integrated into the business. And in this stage, full automation frees up that AP professional to begin to focus on very strategic opportunities in the business, utilizing advanced analytics to drive things like more effective cash management. So not just paying the bills and paying them on time, but really contributing those kinds of insights and analytics that drive much greater business value across the enterprise. So with that evolutionary model in mind, let's also look at what are some of the top challenges that most AP organizations, when polled here again by IOFM, cited as really key stumbling blocks that they really need to address in order to progress along this evolutionary path. And what challenges do most AP teams have in common? I think when you look at the most often cited responses, it's really pretty clear that most organizations are still focused on trying to do a better job of the basics. So improving process efficiency, getting bills not just paid but paid on time, reducing paper, and reducing cost in the process. So less frequently cited as challenges are actually some of the higher value activities. So I wouldn't conclude, therefore, that they're not challenges. It's just not areas that many organizations are able to focus on currently until they address more of those fundamental problems. But the higher strategic value activities include things like improving both internal and external communications, really driving more effective compliance to tax and regulatory agencies, doing more effective cash management, having better analytics and insights, and maximizing key measurements such as days payable outstanding. So some of the top AP challenges, again, I think those at the bottom are the more strategic objectives that aren't necessarily less challenging, just not as accessible to most organizations until they can deal with those fundamentals, those basics on the top half of the responses included here. So when we look at some of the goals and objectives then that AP wants to achieve in this survey coming from Ardent Partners data, it's interesting that really the goals and objectives mirror the challenges in many ways, in that the top responses from a goals and objectives standpoint also tend to focus on addressing those fundamental challenges, be they driving more process automation, better collaboration with procurement, but also with other business stakeholders, and reducing operating costs. So again, less frequently cited are some of those more strategic goals. How do we transform AP into a more strategic and agile business function, and also drive things like improved cash visibility and management, such as maximizing commercial card programs to generate optimal rebates. So the Ardent Partners report next looked at the capabilities. If we want to achieve those goals and objectives, what capabilities do AP teams recognize they'll need in order to boost themselves to that next level of performance. And here, tech tops the wish list, just like we just finished the holiday season, and some of the biggest sellers, most often purchased gifts during the holiday season are tech products, and AP says we want tech too. 58% are saying we need newer, improved technology. In addition, clear focus on probably both tools and processes to improve exception handling and root cause analysis. So streamlining, by reducing the number of exceptions or streamlining the process for resolving those exceptions are recognized as key enablers to increasing productivity for most AP teams. The other thing on the wish list here is some better air cover. AP groups say we need better executive support in order to improve our AP operations. So that also means executive support, of course, is a prerequisite to getting funding to fulfill wish number one on our list, which is the purchase of newer, improved technology. And then some of the other selections here, of course, include better links to not only procurement, but also other internal and external stakeholders, so supplier collaboration, being a better or more frequent collaborator with suppliers, it makes the list here of capabilities as well. So next I want to introduce an E-Invoicing maturity model that sets some different stages and parameters to help benchmark where your organization may be, currently along that journey, along that path towards a transformation. And just in talking about the different stages, and there are 4 of them, the first one, let's call it the nascent stage, really starting at the beginning. So the current state of the AP process, we'll say it's 100% manual or close to that. There may actually be some automation in the form of scanning or at least outsource scanning to a third party to start converting some of the paper into a digital image. But for most intents and purposes, the bulk of the process, it remains manual. The objective, the operational focus is really doing the bare minimum, just paying the bills. And from a technology standpoint, limited use of technology at this stage, probably limited to the legacy ERP system, and as I said, maybe some scanning being done either internally or outsourced to a third party. At this nascent stage, then, the metrics most often tracked are actually production-type metrics. So things like invoices per FTE, they're really looking at pure output measures, not really looking at efficiency or a true value add at this stage. And from a supplier standpoint, there's really limited interaction. There really isn't any interface for the suppliers to collaborate with you from a system standpoint. So suppliers don't really have any visibility to the process, and most AP teams at this nascent stage actually find that they're being inundated with supplier inquiries because lack of visibility typically leads to a phone call, saying, did you get my invoice? Do I need to send you another copy? When am I going to get paid? All those kinds of things take up a disproportionate amount of time for those AP groups responding to inquiries at this nascent stage. So let's move a little bit forward, and to the next second stage, let's call it evolving. And here we've started to introduce a little bit more automation. So let's say we're 80% manual at this point, likely having upgraded from scanning to at least introduce some form of OCR, optical character recognition. So that's going to reduce the amount of data entry if I can use OCR to convert from a like a PDF invoice into populating the fields of a digital invoice. The problem is the OCR technology still is lacking in terms of accuracy. So there's still rework required that someone would have to actually review and often do additional data entry to create a valid invoice into the system. And so at this stage, we've got some benefits of technology as we're in this evolving stage, but we're really not yet able to track analytics and metrics on the process beyond some of the basics, and we're not able to focus on some of the more strategic objectives such as improving cash management. So let's move ahead. Now we're at the mainstream. Let's say where this is most of the market is today. That's sort of a mixed bag, 50% manual, 50% automated. So the key enabler that's been added to get to the mainstream stage is typically an automated approval workflow. So some form of AP automation in addition to the data capture technology, the scanning or OCR that may be used to create the invoice in the system in the first place. Now these mainstream organizations are taking the next step of being able to use automated approval workflow to route that invoice to obtain the necessary approvals to make it okay to pay. So now, from a metrics tracking and analytics standpoint, you're looking at a number of different efficiency and cycle time measures, and the results look a lot better because you're utilizing more of that automated approval routing workflow kind of technology to make the process inherently more efficient. And with a more efficient process in place, these mainstream organizations are now able to start looking at doing things like, taking advantage of early pay discounts. So, for instance, if you've got a cycle time for invoice approval cycles that's, less than 10 days typically, then at least you're going to be able to take advantage of early pay discounts, many of which may be something like, a 2% discount for payment within 10 days on, let's say, a net 30 invoice. So you're really starting to be able to drive some additional value added to the business as well. And of course, with an accelerated invoice approval cycle, you're not only getting the cash discounts, you're not only getting better performance metrics internally, you're also increasing supplier satisfaction because most likely you're able to improve your on-time payment rate. So it's not taking you, an excessive amount of time just to get the invoice approved and ready for payment. So let's go to the final stage, getting to best in class, a true top performer. So here at this stage, we're really talking about an end-to-end automated process, and not just AP automation, but really integration with procure-to-pay, getting AP and procurement on the same page, tying the PO process on the front end and all the control and accuracy that brings then to the back end of the process, the second P, if you will, of P2P, the payment side. The other key characteristic of these best-in-class performers is they're optimized for use of e-invoicing. So they're not starting with, either a paper or a PDF attachment that then has to be scanned or OCR'd and reviewed and checked for accuracy. They're starting with a fully digital invoice. And what that means from a process efficiency standpoint is now being able to use the system to do things like automated matching at a line level to the PO, because most purchase orders and the resulting invoices may have multiple line items. Having that level of sophistication in the system with a fully digital process to let the system and the intelligence built into that do that matching process, so you have an automated match that occurs, really reducing the incidences of exceptions and automating exception handling when it does occur as well. So the other characteristics here, these organizations that have gotten to a best-in-class status, have really used best-of-breed technology. So it's not just efficient processes, but now they have the benefit of digitizing all these documents means I have data. So I've got robust analytics to really be able to track what the organization's spending and where, ways to optimize the process, ways to enhance working capital management, whether that means extending DPO or maximizing early pay discounts. The other key characteristic at this best-in-class stage then is also from a supplier standpoint, suppliers are on a level playing field now as equal business partners and collaborators. And typically that means having introduced a supplier portal technology that gives your suppliers the ability to engage, again, on more of an equal footing and on a self-service basis to have visibility to their invoice approval and payment status, et cetera. So that's the model we all aspire to then, to getting to this most mature or best-in-class stage of development. And, I think as you progress through these different stages, it's helpful to understand what some of those characteristics are to kind of see where you are currently. But the other thing that's helpful is, a set of metrics, benchmark metrics that can kind of help you track, where you're progressing, maybe where you're leading, maybe where you're lagging the market overall, and help you prioritize focus areas as you go forward. And as I said earlier, I've got a set of benchmarks here that come from the Hackett Group's P2P performance study that's just been published. So it's great to have brand new data and metrics because, of course, this is a very dynamic environment, so things change from year to year and certainly are different from one organization to the next. But it's always helpful to take a step back and see where you are vis-a-vis your peers in the market overall. So I want to walk through some key benchmark metrics, and I've stressed how important e-invoicing has been to those top performers or best in class, the ones that are the furthest along that evolutionary or maturity model. And I think this data is particularly revealing. When you look at the, on the left of this slide, this says that top performing organizations are capturing nearly 4 out of every 5 invoices as truly electronic invoices, where there's a huge disparity between those top performing organizations and everyone else. So everyone else is getting less than 30% of their invoices electronically as compared to, as I said, nearly 80% for those top performers. And included here is some fine print, and as always, the devil's in the details, but I think it's important to note the definition of what qualifies as a truly electronic invoice. And the bad news for some of those who may have just seen your back of the envelope calculation go from the 79% to the 28% is that just because you get an invoice as an attachment to an email is an electronic transmission, that doesn't qualify, doesn't meet the test here in our definition of an e-invoice, because after all, someone has to open that attached document and key punch it in or scan it in or OCR it or what have you. So when Hackett defines an e-invoice that constitutes 79% of the transaction volumes for those top performers, it truly is a digital document that's received via a standard protocol over the internet using, not to get too technical, but but standard protocols like CXML or EDI. And the key here is that there's no data entry required, because that electronic invoices passes directly from the supplier system or passes through a portal or a value-added network into your system without any human intervention required. So obviously a critical enabler, and as I said, probably one of the most notable discrepancies between, if you will, the have and the have-not, those organizations that are at a top performer status versus everyone else, the peer group overall. Now, better news, I guess, for the average organization when it comes to electronic payments, it's a much narrower gap. And this really says that, you know, most organizations have done a pretty good job of getting rid of paper checks. So 63% for the peer group say that their payments are electronic, meaning they're, you know, not issuing a paper check. They're using an electronic funds transfer or ACH payments, electronic payments or wire transfers, and you know, a little bit better penetration, obviously, for top performers at better than 80%, but clearly not as wide a disparity. And you know, some work to do for the laggards, but certainly one clear message would be that anybody that still has the majority of payments issued as paper checks would have to consider themselves lagging behind the curve on that particular metric. So next I want to look at you know, this idea of starting the process with a digital image and continuing that process by using electronic approval workflow. And this is an area where, again, the top performers have clearly distinguished themselves. So if you go back to the previous slide, we said top performers are getting 79% of their invoice volume as truly as true e-invoices. Now they're supplementing that, so the remaining 21% they're converting into a digital image by using scanning or OCR technology. So top performers, in fact, don't enter paper into their system at all. They're able to convert 100% of the volume into a digital image to really kickstart that entire process. So they've got 100% of invoices available online when they initiate their approval workflow process. And when it comes to an automated approval workflow routing, the top performing organizations not only have an automated system, but have automated follow-up capabilities as well. So they're able to define invoice approval workflow processes, to configure that into a system, to automatically route them, but then also to be able to automate the follow-up process. So that may include things like alerts and reminders or escalation and delegation in the approval workflow process to make sure that it proceeds without a hitch. Now, when it comes to the area of what types of connectivity are being used to enable suppliers and for suppliers to submit invoices, again, this is an area where the top performers have shown much higher adoption rates of more advanced connectivity methods with suppliers. So nearly 3/4 of top performers are using advanced methods of connectivity, such as deploying a supplier portal. So this would be, even if it's hosted by a third party, it would be a one-to-many portal. It would be their portal for interfacing with their supply base. Or they may be using some version of a many-to-many portal. So again, a third-party hosted supplier network or EDI value-added network that would have multiple buyers and multiple suppliers engaging and sharing business documents and transactions through a fully electronic method. So those top performers are very rarely using things like pure email transport just 10% of the time, or still stuck with primarily a paper-based process just 18% of the time. And clearly, the average organization, it's sort of the reverse image that the majority of the connectivity methods being used there are some of the more basic or manual, less penetration within the average or peer group of the more advanced connectivity methods. So if you get invoices electronically to begin with, they're more accurate, they're more actionable because they're ready for you to route for approval through your system, and that approval routing is fully automated, so it tends to be faster. It's not surprising then that once again top performers have realized accelerated cycle times, somewhere between 33% to 40% faster, so about 40% faster processing cycle time in the case of a PO invoice, and about 1/3 faster, 4 days as compared to 6 days for non-PO invoices. But I'll tell you that this is encouraging in a significant regard in that not more than a year or two ago, the discrepancy between the top performers and the peer groups would have been much more pronounced, whereas the average cycle times are certainly higher for non-PO invoices, but were often 15, 20 days or more, clearly outside of the lead time to take advantage of things like early pay discounts, for example. And that gap has really been narrowed, and at the same time, top performers have begun to see their opportunity to reduce cycle time plateau. They've really captured sort of most of the efficiencies that have been gained from a cycle time reduction, so you can speed the process along to a significant extent with the introduction of technology, but there's still some time, some wait time inherent in even the most automated process when individuals need to review and approve invoices before they're ready to pay. So that 3 to 4 days is probably about as good as it gets. Maybe some opportunity to shave, incrementally, fractional improvements from there. But in any case, getting to that type of efficiency, 3 to 4 days in invoice cycle time, really gives you lots of flexibility. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to pay sooner if your strategy is to maximize working capital by, extending DPO, for example, but the visibility and control that's inherent there, but by getting through the process faster, really understanding what liabilities are on hand to do a better job of allocating cash and maximizing working capital, all strategic benefits to the business. So whether you pay faster or not, being able to review and approve and get invoices ready to pay faster has strategic insights and benefits to the business. So whereas that gap in terms of cycle time was relatively narrow between the top performing organizations and the average organizations, when it comes to some of these key productivity measures, a significant disparity still remains. And I think it's very revealing if we look at, a very basic metric, such as invoices processed per FTE. So this is, on an annual basis, invoices processed per FTE, and a case of where you got, a 1.5x productivity advantage on behalf of those top performers. So you're a top performing organization, the average AP FTE is processing north of 22,000 invoices per year versus just about 9,000 for the peer group overall. So in any business process, it takes good process, it takes talented people and good technology, of course, but I think this is an area where you're looking at this order of magnitude difference from a productivity standpoint, and it's clear that the biggest differentiator there has to be the adoption of advanced technology, because no one AP organization's process or people are that much better than the next to be able to explain that kind of a quantum gain in terms of productivity. It really comes down to the introduction of advanced automation technologies to get that order of magnitude kind of increase. And it's expressed differently. That advantage for top performers means that on a per invoice, their processing costs are less than, are more than 50% lower than the peer group overall. So whereas the average organization incurs nearly $5 per invoice, which is primarily based on people's time involved in the process to enter an invoice, review it, approve it for payment, etc. But this calculation, and included in the fine print here from the Hackett benchmark, would also include any enabling technology that's being used as part of the cost basis to then derive a per invoice transaction cost. But again, a significant improvement and cost reduction opportunity available to those organizations that matriculate through that evolution curve and get to that top performer or best-in-class status. And on-time payment rates, a fundamental metric used by nearly every AP group. Some good news here in that, once again, in this particular case, not as big a disparity between top-performing organizations at better than 9 out of 10 invoices that get paid on time, as compared to about 83% for the overall group. So most organizations are doing a pretty good job of making sure that they can do that basic requirement, which is get the bills paid on time. I want to talk about some of the more sophisticated techniques that some of these top-performing organizations are utilizing to really balance their processes. When they look at procure-to-pay processes, for example, they don't look at that as a single monolithic process, one-size-fits-all, that every type of purchase for a product or service is bought and paid for in the same way. And what these best-in-class organizations are doing in particular is identifying, for instance, opportunities to streamline the process, use a two-way match in some cases, as opposed to a more time intensive or labor-intensive three-way match process, for example. So in the Hackett model, they've benchmarked, again, top performers against the average, and they've identified that top-performing organizations process 42% of their line items through what would be defined as optimal channels, which in this model is everything other than the first swim lane on the top, which is the traditional three-way match, or the swim lane at the very bottom, the dreaded invoice-only or no PO invoice. That's a worst practice for everyone. In the middle, what they've identified is that in some cases, for particular types of transactions, there may be a more efficient way to satisfy all your objectives. Make sure that you've got an appropriate level of control, but given the type of the commodity being purchased and the level of expenditure, but that's balanced with the getting an appropriate level of efficiency for that particular type of purchase. So just to look at a few examples of where this strategy can be employed. Now, the second swim lane here is something called assumed receipt. So a two-way match with the PO and invoice as an example. So that in that case, it may be a relatively small dollar purchase, things like office supplies where you can at least remove the requirement for receiving those low dollar value goods and just pay on a PO to invoice match. Now, some of the other sort of buy pay channel strategies that can really optimize AP include ERS, so evaluated receipt settlement, actually removes the invoice from the process altogether. So this strategy would be most appropriate, particularly for things like direct materials or MRO, maintenance, repair, and operations, which tend to involve some very strategic supply relationships where you're utilizing that direct material supplier or MRO supplier on a very frequent basis. You've got a track record with that organization. The pricing and other terms really don't fluctuate very often. So in that case, it may be appropriate simply to complete a two-way match just with the PO and the receipt. So as long as you know that these items have been delivered according to the PO or the contract, and you've got them most often then in inventory, you don't really require an invoice in that case. Now, another example of efficiency for AP is those recurring invoices, things like rent payments, where you've got a contract or a lease agreement in place, and you've got an invoice, but do you really need to approve that invoice month after month when the rent payment stays the same, and you know it's just a standard trigger that it's whatever, the 10th of the month, it's time to pay the rent, for example. And the other opportunity is certainly the use of cards, either purchase cards or travel cards, represent an opportunity to eliminate invoices from the process altogether. So that doesn't mean that three-way match is going away. It's still appropriate for nearly, even for the top performers, for nearly half of the total spend and about a little bit more than a third of the transactions. But the idea here is maybe the three-way match isn't required in each and every instance. Find those opportunities to strike that right balance between control and process efficiency, and just try to avoid that bottom swim lane, which is the invoice only that no one wants to be stuck in as a worst practice. So one of the clear benefits of automating AP is to really increase the first pass match rate. And really significant here that those top performing organizations are getting nearly 90% of invoices that flow through on a first pass match. So a touchless kind of a process. So obviously, anytime you got nearly 90% of your volume flowing through without any requirement of intervention, you're going to be able to be much more productive in managing the relatively rare exception and being able to focus on more strategic analytics and cash management. Now, how do you get to that kind of top performer status with a first pass match? Now, certainly, AP automation technology is part of it, but when you look at the right-hand side, the most commonly cited reasons for first pass match failure, it really zeroes in on the real need to have an integrated P2P process, a PO process on the front end that's going to minimize the most cited incidences of first-pass match failure, which is a mismatch between, the order from a price or quantity standpoint, or simply not having the source documents to complete either the three-way or two-way match, in that you've got an invoice but no receipt or no PO. So we look at those common problems. The combination of AP automation, but having that as part of an integrated approach to P2P, is really the most clear path towards achieving top performer status as regards first pass matches, such that you can get to that 90% level of efficiency. So one of the other characteristics that is distinguishing the top performing organizations here is their use of supplier portal technology. So this data looks at what method is most commonly being used by AP groups to resolve inquiries. Most are still using email, many more are using the phone. A small group of early adopters, which correlates directly to the top performers, have deployed self-service portals. And the benefit that they're seeing is actually being able to resolve nearly 50% of inquiries through self-service, meaning AP doesn't have to get involved at all. Nearly half of the time, if suppliers can go to a portal and have visibility to their own invoice approval and payment status, they're not then going to pick up the phone to call AP. So finally, I wanted to share with you just a quick case study. And again, the encouraging aspect here is this evolution doesn't have to take place over a period of years. Case study I'm going to share with you from a private insurance company really took them from the starting point, which was that first stage of being a nascent type organization, through to really a best-in-class performer in less than 12 months. How was that accomplished? Well, first let's take a look at the before picture. The challenges that they faced are probably pretty familiar to many organizations. So limited technology available, really just the incumbent ERP with a lot of limitations, meaning AP was still doing extensive manual work in order to manage the invoice approval process. And there wasn't an efficient process for onboarding suppliers either. So you don't have one version of the truth, either for supplier or invoice data. And that introduces not only inefficiency in the process, but inherently risk as well. So in deploying a full AP automation, in fact, a full P2P solution, what this insurance company was able to do is actually deploy automated approval workflow routing to get that efficiency, deploy the supplier portal to convert paper-based invoices to electronic, at least for a significant portion, about 80% of the invoice volume, and also to be able to give suppliers that self-service visibility. And the results, pretty dramatic. One-third cycle time reduction in the invoice approval cycles, and that led directly to capturing about a 1% savings in the form of prompt pay discounts on 1/3 of the total spend. Just having the process standardization and visibility allowed them to reduce the incidence of duplicate or overpayments, resulting in $100,000 in savings from duplicate payments alone. 87% productivity increase on the part of vendor management staff, because the self-service portal allowed suppliers to do more of the lion's share of creating a profile and registering online and checking their own invoice status, to do that themselves instead of having internal staff having to perform those functions. And a 40% time spent by AP on invoice processing due to this three-way automated invoice match capability, and lots of additional benefits by driving more savings from strategic sourcing because of having more accurate spend data, and also just more satisfied stakeholders in boosting the net promoter score for the organization. So that's just a quick case study of how this journey can be accomplished very quickly. I didn't accomplish everything I wanted to cover in the webinar today very quickly, so I know we only have a few minutes for any questions that may be out there. Sanjivani.
Thank you so much, Richard. We do have a few questions that we want to take. So the first one says, what role does AP procurement collaboration play in enabling AP to move to the next stage of maturity?
Yeah, great question, and I really, I know I've referred several times to this idea of not just automating the second P of P2P, but a full procure-to-pay automation, and that speaks to the critical linkage between payables and procurement, and getting control on by introducing a robust standardized PO process on the front end is going to be one of the most fundamental enablers for achieving maturity downstream in the AP process, because if I've got an electronic PO, for example, I can now enable my suppliers to flip that PO into an electronic invoice back to me. I can use the system to match the lines on the PO to the lines on the invoice and be able to, within a tolerance match on price and quantity and all those other key controls, and let the system do that checking instead of having to apply AP labor to those tasks. So I think it's absolutely critical.
Sure. The second question that we have is, are there any prerequisites that are to be kept in mind before transitioning from one stage to another, let's say from the evolving to the mainstream stage?
Yeah, I think just going back to the model that we introduced, in that evolving stage from a technology standpoint, it's probably limited at that stage to just the core ERP capabilities, with the addition perhaps of some type of scanning or imaging technology or OCR. To get to that next mainstream level, you're really talking about adding to that capability an automated approval workflow, automated invoice matching, and at least starting to enable true electronic invoicing so that you're not always having to rely on converting a paper or a PDF document through some type of scanning or imaging or OCR process.
Sure. Another question is that we spoke a lot about the matrix about best-in-class organizations. So what are these matrices that best-in-class organizations usually keep track of?
Yeah, I've introduced a number of key metrics, and I think, it's helpful to have a lot of different ones because some may be more meaningful to one organization than the next, but, I think there's a handful that should really be on anybody's radar. You'll never get away from the on-time payment rate because I think that's been a fundamental measure of every AP group since before technology. You always had to determine that, you're going to pay your bills on time even in the olden days, but add to that now, the cycle time for the process. How long is it taking you to get through the invoice approvals? The first pass match rate as really a key metric, because as long as you have a high volume of exceptions, you're never going to get as productive as possible. And at the end of the day, what does it cost you to deliver the service you're providing to the organization? So something like the process cost per invoice as well.
Sure. Just one more question before we log off. So the question says, what are some of the timelines that we can look at to move to the next stage of AP maturity?
Well, and I think that's one of the things that's most encouraging. So, you know, takeaway for the folks who joined today, you may look at some of the characteristics in the maturity model and say, wow, I'm still behind the curve, I'm at the nascent, or I'm just starting to get into the evolving stage. But, you know, as demonstrated in the case study, as I said, that evolution from nascent to top performer really occurred in less than 12 months. So, you know, the technology is easier to use, more affordable than ever, can be deployed very quickly, and can enable a very rapid transformation. So hopefully that's you know, encouraging for everyone to take away today, and that even if you're at the, you know, in the starting gates, this type of transformation can be accomplished very quickly these days.
Sure, that sounds great. So I'd like to thank you, Richard, for taking time out and delivering this webinar for us. And I'd like to thank all the attendees for attending this webinar and giving us their time. Thank you so much.